Winter 1944, South Texas, 320 words. The sun is low over the mesquite brush, burning the horizon a dull copper. Dust moves in thin ribbons across the caliche road that runs beside a line of barbed wire. Beyond it, rows of whitewashed barracks, watchtowers, and the faint smell of boiled coffee from a mess hall stove. It is Crystal City, Texas, 1944. Officially, it's a family internment camp of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service. Unofficially, it's a world behind wire, a fenced town of Germans, Japanese, and Italians, all labeled enemy aliens. Women hang laundry between posts. Children chase a scuffed ball through dust. A sign above the gate reads simply, Crystal City Alien Detention Station. A bus idles outside the camp fence, its sides painted military gray. A small group of guards stand near it, their khaki uniforms dusted white by the road. On the other side of the wire, a handful of internees, German women, many from Latin America, prepare to board for day labor. They've been approved to pick spinach and onions in nearby fields. Across the road, a ranch hand leans on a wooden fence, hat tilted, watching. He's no soldier, just another Texan trying to keep a farm alive during wartime. The music on his truck's radio is faint. Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade. For a moment he looks up, and one of the women glances back. Neither smiles, neither waves. But the glance holds longer than it should. That's all it takes. History will later call these camps temporary, controlled, forgotten. But in the dry heart of Texas, behind wire and watchtowers, something unexpected began to take root. Something the war itself couldn't stop. To understand how that glance was even possible, we have to step back to the policies, the ships, and the fear that brought German women to Texas. The long road to Texas. By 1941, the world was burning. Nazi Germany had swept across Europe. The U-boats haunted the Atlantic, and across the Americas, fear of espionage grew like wildfire. The United States, still not yet a direct combatant, began to prepare for the possibility that even inside its borders, danger could hide in plain sight. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, that fear hardened into policy. Within days, the U.S. government authorized the Department of Justice and the FBI to detain enemy aliens, citizens or residents of Axis nations living on American soil. Most were men, but soon entire families would be swept up. Across the southern plains, federal agents and local police began compiling lists. In the first months of 1942, they came for teachers, priests, business owners, even musicians with German or Italian heritage. Some had lived in the U.S. for decades. Others were immigrants stranded by the war. Many spoke English fluently, pledged loyalty to America, but it did not matter. Nationality now defined suspicion. While most of these arrests occurred in major cities or coastal ports, Texas became a logistical keystone in this expanding network of detention. The state offered open land, rail connections, and a climate harsh enough to discourage escape. By mid-1942, construction began on a series of sites: Kennedy, Seagoville, and the most famous of them all, Crystal City, southwest of San Antonio. The camps in the Lone Star State, the Seagoville internment camp near Dallas, was among the first to open. Originally a women's federal prison, it was converted into a family camp surrounded by barbed wire and floodlights. Here, German and Japanese women lived in converted dormitories, each room barely the size of a modest kitchen. There was running water, a communal kitchen, and strict schedules. Further south, the Kennedy camp housed mostly men, while Crystal City, completed in late 1942, became the central hub for entire families. Unlike the barbed chaos of some military-run camps, Crystal City resembled a self-contained town, a small city behind fences. It had schools, gardens, a hospital, even a swimming pool. But it was a prison all the same. The internees' days were measured by inspections, roll calls, and the hum of guards' boots on gravel. There were lessons for children, taught in both German and English, and for the women, chores that filled the hours: washing, sewing, tending vegetable patches. They were allowed letters, censored and delayed, and occasional parcels from relatives abroad. Who were these women? They were not all from Germany itself. Some were German expatriates from Latin America, particularly from Brazil, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Peru. When war erupted, the U.S. pressured those nations to arrest and deport suspected Axis sympathizers, sometimes entire families, shipping them north to America under relocation agreements. They arrived by ship at New Orleans or Galveston, then by train to Texas. Few of these women had ever set foot in the United States before. They were teachers, secretaries, farmers' wives, even missionaries. They brought children, sometimes American-born, sometimes not, and carried what little they could: a Bible, a family photograph, a suitcase of clothes. The irony was bitter. Many of them had fled Europe to escape war, only to find themselves imprisoned in a country they barely knew. Still, official language called them protective custody aliens, as if the fences were for their safety. Texas, the ideal cage for federal planners, Texas was perfect. The land was cheap, flat, and isolated. Rail lines from the Gulf connected to farms desperate for labor. And in wartime America, patriotism blurred easily into prejudice. Communities near the camps viewed them with wary fascination. Enemy towns in their backyard. Guards at Crystal City were mostly local men, former ranch hands and deputies now wearing federal uniforms. They patrolled the fences in jeeps, rifles slung casually across shoulders, more watchful than hostile. For them, it was a job that paid steady wages in a time of ration books and shortages. The internees, meanwhile, adjusted to the rhythm of the South Texas climate. Searing days, cool nights, and long stretches of wind that carried the smell of cedar and cattle. It was not Europe, but it was not hell either. It was limbo. Life behind the wire inside the camp, routine became a survival tool. The German women organized sewing circles, choir rehearsals, and small festivals. Christmas trees cut from the brush outside, hand-painted ornaments from ration tins. Children played soccer on makeshift fields, their laughter drifting toward the guard towers. They called their streets after hometowns left behind. Hamburgstrasse, Köln-Allee. In a strange way, these names became anchors, fragments of identity in a place where everything was temporary. Still, every morning the loudspeaker crackled with orders. Every letter they wrote passed under an English censor's pen, and every face they saw outside the fence reminded them they were prisoners. The world beyond the wire, the war machine consumed everything. By 1943, Texas was teeming with German and Italian POWs. Soldiers captured in North Africa and Europe, shipped by the thousands to rural camps. These were not the civilian internees of Crystal City, but hardened troops now picking cotton, baling hay, or working sawmills. The U.S. War Department's prisoner of war labor program filled the manpower gap left by American men overseas. From Amarillo to Laredo, from cotton fields to canneries, foreign labor kept the state's wartime economy alive. The distinction between POWs and internees was vital on paper, but in the Texas sun, behind similar fences, the line blurred. Locals simply called them all the Germans. The silent encounter. Occasionally, under supervision, some internees were allowed to work outside the camp. They gathered crops for local farms, tended gardens, or repaired machinery in controlled groups. These programs were officially designed to combat food shortages, but unofficially, they brought human contact back into lives that had been stripped of it. Farmers would drive out to the pickup points. The bus would arrive from Crystal City, and the workers would file out quietly, escorted by guards. It was during one of these routines, on a ranch near Carrizo Springs, that a local cowboy first spoke to an internee. His words are not recorded, but the story passed down through the town years later. He said, "Good morning." She smiled. That was all. Behind that small courtesy lay a universe of rules, orders, and invisible lines drawn by war. But even in a country at total mobilization, humanity has a way of leaking through wire. Two worlds on the same soil. To the people of South Texas, the camps were both curiosity and contradiction. Locals drove by to glimpse the foreigners. Children whispered rumors of spies and secret radios. Yet, as months passed, hostility softened into a kind of neighborly tolerance. The war felt far away, and the internees, under their discipline and quiet dignity, seemed less like threats and more like displaced souls. For ranchers struggling with labor shortages, the presence of disciplined, educated Germans nearby offered a practical solution. Letters and petitions began to flow through channels. Requests to hire camp internees for seasonal labor. Bureaucrats in Washington hesitated, then approved limited contracts. Thus, under strict escort and supervision, the first groups of German women began stepping beyond the fences to work. Texas soil. It was a system born of necessity, but fated to create connections far beyond what the paperwork intended. 2. Understand how those two worlds began to touch. Through the fences, the fields, and the daily grind of wartime survival, we now look closer at the human texture of these encounters. Texas. The wartime crossroads. By 1943, Texas had become one of the largest custodians of the Axis world outside Europe. More than 65,000 German POWs and several thousand civilian internees were scattered across the state. From the pine woods of East Texas to the arid scrublands of the South, the war's human debris had found a strange second life. Every week, trains delivered new arrivals to sidings near small towns. Seguin, Hearn, Hereford, Camp Swift, and dozens more. Each new group was processed, tagged, and distributed to satellite camps or civilian work details. For local communities, it was both surreal and routine. Prisoners of the Reich picking cotton under the Texas sun, while American soldiers fought Germans in Normandy. Yet within this logistical sprawl, Crystal City and Segoville remained unique. These were not uniformed soldiers. They were women, children, and civilians, many of them innocent of any offense beyond ancestry. And unlike the military camps, their fences were built not just to contain, but to separate them from the fear of the outside world. Bureaucracy and barbed wire running the camps was the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, under the Department of Justice. Unlike the War Department's military prisons, the INS operated with civilian oversight. This meant schools, medical care, even a semblance of self-administration within the fences. The goal, officially, was humane internment, but that word, humane, bent under the weight of reality. Supplies were rationed, inspections relentless, and privacy non-existent. The guards were often overworked, the staff undertrained, and the internees constantly reminded that the slightest infraction, a misplaced remark, a misinterpreted gesture, could mean transfer to a harsher facility. Yet, even under such control, routine bred familiarity. Guards saw the same faces every day. Local drivers learned to expect the same work crews at the same hour. The machinery of surveillance over time became the backdrop to ordinary human coexistence. Wartime labor and the line between. The United States was fighting a two-front war, and manpower was its lifeblood. By 1943, with millions of Americans overseas, a domestic labor crisis hit home. Farms, canneries, and rail depots struggled to operate. The federal government answered with War Manpower Commission programs, contracting foreign prisoners under carefully regulated non-military labor. Texas farms needed hands to pick fruit, cotton, and vegetables. So the government struck a deal. Supervised POWs and internees could fill those roles under local contracts, provided they worked under guard and returned to camp by dusk. For the women of Crystal City and Segoville, this meant limited excursions into the world beyond the wire. They traveled in buses marked DOJ property, often with 2 guards present. Each worker wore an identification tag, and their pay went not directly to them, but to the camp administration. A credit system redeemable for small comforts like soap, cloth, or stationery. What mattered, though, was not the money. It was the air, the sound of wind over open pasture, the sight of cattle moving through a distant gate. After months of confinement, Such small sensations carried the weight of freedom. The rancher's view to the ranchers and farmers, the internment labor program was practical. Cotton still needed to be picked. Vegetables still had to be harvested for the army canteens and civilian ration chains. Able-bodied men were gone, and the local youth were either in uniform or working defense plants in Houston and Dallas. Many of these Texans were descendants of immigrants themselves. Germans, Czechs, Poles. Their grandparents had settled the state in the 19th century, carving homesteads from mesquite and clay. So when they saw the Germans behind the wire, there was a flicker of uneasy recognition. Not all approved of their presence. Local newspapers occasionally published alarmist editorials about enemy agents in custody nearby. But in towns where the war felt far away, pragmatism usually won out. As one farmer from Dimmitt County said in a 1946 interview, "They worked hard, never caused trouble, and seemed glad to breathe free air. The war was somewhere else." The encounter culture, at first, contact between locals and internees was limited to work details. The guards watched closely. Any conversation beyond instruction could be punished. Yet, as weeks turned to months, rules softened under familiarity. A ranch wife might bring extra sandwiches for the workers. A child might wave from the fence. A farmhand might stop to explain how to saddle a horse or stack hay. The South Texas sun equalized everything. It was too hot to maintain hatred for long. In many accounts preserved later by local historians, what began as cautious civility turned into curiosity. The German women, many educated and fluent in several languages, fascinated the Texans. They carried themselves with formality, spoke of art and music, and seemed untouched by the rough manners of frontier life. Conversely, the Texans appeared to these women as the embodiment of something raw and unbroken. Men who worked with their hands, spoke plainly and lived by land and sky. Cultural distance met human magnetism. The thaw inside the camps, the war's outcome was uncertain. News arrived slowly, often censored, sometimes distorted. Rumors circulated of Allied advances, of bombings in Berlin, of lost relatives. The emotional toll was immense. Psychologists working for the War Department noted an unusual pattern. Despite being detained, internees showed high morale in Texas camps compared to those elsewhere. They attributed it to climate, self-governance, and access to limited outside work. But behind the data, something simpler was at work: contact. Even a brief exchange through a fence could remind a prisoner that she still existed as an individual, not a number. And on the outside, Texans saw that enemy aliens were not faceless threats, but people with stories, laughter, and grief. A quiet defiance. The official guidelines forbade personal relationships. Any attempt at romantic involvement, even a letter, was punishable by transfer or deportation. But rules made in Washington meant little under a Texas sky stretching 30 miles in every direction. So occasionally a gesture slipped through. A folded note hidden in a produce crate. A Bible left open on a fence post. A whispered exchange when guards looked away. Most of these small rebellions vanished into dust, unrecorded. But some left traces. Wedding records, photographs, local church registries noting German brides. Enough, decades later, for historians to piece together a quiet pattern. In wartime Texas, a handful of German women left the camps not as prisoners, but as wives. The unwritten rule camp officials knew, unofficially, that such connections occurred. Most turned a blind eye, provided order was maintained and no scandals reached Washington. The unwritten rule was simple: don't embarrass the commandant. What mattered was paperwork, not emotion. This uneasy tolerance gave space for something the war had almost extinguished: empathy. A few guards helped deliver letters or vouched for local sponsors who employed internees. Some local pastors officiated marriages after careful vetting. The war's machinery could control movement, but not choice. A fence line of fate by late 1944, as Allied forces pushed into Germany and Japan's empire crumbled, the future of the camps came into question. Repatriation lists were drawn up, Ships were prepared to carry internees back across the Atlantic or south to their countries of origin. Yet some refused to leave. A woman from Bremen, married to a Texas ranch hand, petitioned to stay. Her case file, still preserved in the National Archives, contains a single line typed by an INS official. Subject has married an American citizen of sound moral character. No further action required. That small bureaucratic mercy marked the end of her captivity and the beginning of something that official history rarely records: peace, at a human scale. The war was ending, but the story was only beginning. For within these encounters, we find not just politics or policy, but the very essence of wartime contradiction: fear meeting compassion, suspicion meeting humanity. From these small points of contact came stories that can be seen from many angles: human, tactical, technological, and moral. Angle Y: the human core behind every file, every policy, every regulation. There was a heartbeat. For the German women in Texas, life in captivity was not measured in years, but in seasons. Spring brought dust storms that coated the barracks in red powder. Summer meant work details under skies that shimmered like glass. Every day began the same: roll call, inspection, breakfast, and then the slow march of routine. But the sameness was deceptive. Inside the monotony, a quiet transformation unfolded. Isolation had stripped these women of everything familiar: their homes, neighbors, even their language outside the camp. So they clung to what was left: dignity, order, and memory. A seamstress from Hamburg taught sewing to other internees, fashioning dresses from flour sacks. A former piano teacher from Costa Rica improvised hymnals from memory. In the evenings when the wind died, they sang softly in the dark, hymns that mixed longing and faith. And beyond the fence, life was equally regimented for the Texans. The war had drained the land of its sons. Fathers worked dawn to dusk to keep the ranches alive. Wives mended, cooked, and waited for letters from Europe or the Pacific. Loneliness settled across the plains like the evening heat. When the buses carrying internees began to appear on farm roads, it wasn't attraction at first sight. It was recognition. A recognition of shared endurance. Both sides lived within boundaries they hadn't chosen. In small towns like Uvalde, Kennedy, or Crystal City itself, people later recalled these women as polite, hard-working, and graceful. They wrote letters home with perfect penmanship and accents softened by time. They carried themselves like people determined not to be broken. And in the face of that quiet resilience, hearts began to soften. Angle 2: the tactical and administrative machine for the bureaucrats in Washington and the camp commandants in Texas. Emotion was irrelevant. The camps were logistical problems: inventories of bodies, food, and transport schedules. Each internee was a number, each request a form. The Immigration and Naturalization Service kept exhaustive records: identification cards, medical files, incident logs, work rosters. In these archives, the human story hides behind codes: A23817, female, German, interned 1243, employed in field detail. To the administrators, that line was the whole story. The system was designed to run without sentiment. Guards received manuals instructing them to maintain professional detachment at all times. Contact with internees was to be limited to orders, inspections, and emergency procedures. Any fraternization, the manual warned, compromises national security and discipline. And yet, as months passed, even the most rigid protocols began to erode under routine. Guards shared cigarettes at the perimeter. Doctors treated children who reminded them of their own. One warden at Segoville later admitted in testimony that it was impossible to see them as enemies. They were women and mothers, not soldiers. Meanwhile, the War Manpower Commission's labor program became increasingly pragmatic. The goal was output: crops harvested, supply chains maintained. Under those priorities, emotion was officially invisible, but quietly tolerated. In a state built on personal relationships, where everyone knew everyone, even the camp fence couldn't fully separate the worlds. A rancher who hired camp labor one week might share Sunday church with a guard the next. Information flowed quietly. Who was kind? Who was cruel? Who could be trusted? Beneath the official silence, a small web of understanding formed. Within that web, compassion found tiny gaps to slip through. Angle 3. The enemy who wasn't. The war's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to define who the enemy was. Posters, newsreels, and radio programs painted Germans and Japanese as monolithic threats, ruthless, disciplined, alien. But when the enemy appeared in person, sunburned, exhausted, polite, the narrative cracked. Texans were no strangers to German culture. Communities like New Braunfels, Fredericksburg, and Born had been founded by German settlers in the 1800s. Their towns still held Oktoberfests, Lutheran churches, and gravestones carved in old dialects. When they heard the internese accents, many locals recognized echoes of their grandparents. One elderly woman from Seguin later recalled, "They sounded like my father's cousins, only their eyes were sadder." The idea that these women were spies or saboteurs felt absurd to most who met them. They were young mothers, nurses, teachers. Their crimes were often nothing more than being German in a world that no longer tolerated gray zones. The moral dissonance was palpable. Here, on Texas soil, a woman could be imprisoned for her passport, while her cousin might be fighting for the U.S. Army in France under a different flag. Some guards struggled with that contradiction. A few began quietly advocating for leniency, forwarding petitions for better treatment or release. Others simply looked the other way when kindness occurred. They had come to see the internees not as a threat, but as victims of geography and fear. The result was a strange coexistence. Within the fences, Germans planted gardens, built playgrounds, and celebrated Christmas with paper lanterns and hymns. Outside, Texans fought drought, worked overtime, and prayed for their sons. Two different wars, fought in the same heat. A shared silence. Despite proximity, few spoke openly about what they saw. To acknowledge empathy for the enemy was to invite suspicion. So the encounters remained wordless. A passing of tools, a nod, a glance. And yet those silences were heavy with meaning. It was in these silent exchanges that the first seeds of connection formed. Fragile, unrecorded, but real. The barbed wire might have marked the limits of law, but not of recognition. Over time, compassion became habit. And habit became memory. When the war finally ended, and the fences came down, those who had once been forbidden to speak often found they could not forget. Some wrote letters across oceans. Others stayed in touch with families they'd worked for, and a few, the rare few, turned those quiet moments into lifelong bonds. The rules of Washington had built walls of steel, but Texas, with its wide horizons and stubborn humanity, kept opening doors. If rules drew the lines, technology and terrain colored them in, from buses and barbed wire to telephones, chain-link gates, and endless sky. Angle R4. The technology of confinement. The architecture of captivity was everywhere. Even freedom had to pass through steel. At Crystal City, the fences stretched for more than 300 acres, double-lined with barbed wire. Between the two perimeters ran a narrow patrol road where guards cycled day and night. Floodlights stood on wooden poles, their beams cutting through dust storms and midnight fog. Every few hundred feet a watchtower rose above the mesquite. Manned, rotating, precise, and yet for all its hardware the camp felt strangely fragile. The barbed wire sagged in the wind, the towers creaked, and dust coated everything. It was a machine built to keep people in, but not to keep the world out. Sound traveled easily. The clatter of pots from the kitchen, a radio playing somewhere beyond the fence, the distant moo of cattle from the open plains. Buses were the arteries of this machine. Painted gray, each carried a stamped plate that read, U.S. Department of Justice Property. Every morning the bus idled at the camp gate. A guard checked the roster, another verified identification tags, small rectangles of laminated paper marked with photo, number, and camp code. The internees filed on in silence. Windows were covered halfway with painted panels so they could see only the sky and treetops. To anyone watching from the road, it looked like a routine convoy. Inside, hearts raced at the thought of the open air ahead. The buses took narrow farm roads, some unpaved, some barely more than wagon tracks. They passed water towers, windmills, and herds of longhorn cattle before pulling into fields owned by local ranchers. There the gates opened. Fences met fences, one for prisoners, one for livestock, and in that small overlap, two worlds brushed shoulders. Communication was limited, but not impossible. A few words of English here, a few words of German there. Laughter at a shared mistake. The smell of hay and sunburnt leather mingled with the starch of camp uniforms. The same buses would return before dusk. At the gate, guards logged each number again. By nightfall, the women were back inside their barracks, but their thoughts remained out there, in the fields, and fading light. It was technology serving control, yet it inadvertently became a bridge. Every wheel that turned brought the world a little closer. Angle V. Leadership and local authority. Running a wartime camp in Texas required more than discipline. It required judgment. Every commandant, sheriff, and pastor involved in this strange machinery of custody stood at a moral crossroads, between order and understanding. At Segoville, Warden Herbert M. King was known for strict rules but quiet fairness. He insisted on inspections, curfews, and full compliance with Washington directives, but also authorized schools, libraries, and holiday celebrations within the fences. His reports often included phrases like good conduct and model behavior, an administrative shorthand for peace maintained through empathy. At Crystal City, Commandant Joseph O'Rourke, a veteran of the First World War, wrote in his log that family camps require the patience of a teacher more than the firmness of a soldier. He understood that morale was security. Happy prisoners caused fewer problems, so he allowed gardening, sports, and limited church services. To his superiors, these were management strategies. To the internees, they were glimpses of humanity. Local pastors and priests, too, became quiet intermediaries. They delivered sermons through the fence, organized donations of clothing, and sometimes officiated baptisms or funerals for internees who died in custody. Each ceremony was recorded in duplicate, one for the camp, one for the church registry, creating a rare overlap of sacred and state. And then there were the sheriffs and ranchers who signed sponsorship papers. To employ an internee, a Texan had to submit a formal request, vouching for their character and ensuring transportation. Those who did often faced whispers from neighbors. Why help the enemy? But necessity and conscience outweighed pride. Many of these local figures became unintentional witnesses to compassion. They saw bonds forming where none were supposed to exist. They reported it quietly, if at all. As one camp inspector wrote in 1945, local attitudes remain cooperative, though personal fraternization is noted. The human element persists. The human element, that was the crack in the system. Angle 6. The moral and legal line. The rules were clear. Romantic or personal relationships between internees and American civilians were strictly forbidden under the Alien Enemy Act and wartime security codes. The reasons were stated in bureaucratic language: to prevent compromise of personnel and maintain the integrity of operations. In plain English, no love across the wire, but human nature had no section number. When affection grew between a Texan and an internee, it entered a gray zone no regulation could fully control. Camp administrators called it emotional fraternization. Washington called it a threat to discipline. And yet, it kept happening, quietly, discreetly, almost invisibly. In the archives, evidence appears only as fragments. A disciplinary note marked improper correspondence. A transfer order without explanation. A photograph in a family album showing a woman in plain dress beside a ranch fence. Sometimes relationships led to scandal, discovered letters, intercepted notes. Those involved were punished. reassigned, relocated, or warned. But in other cases, petitions for marriage reached the desks of officials. These were reviewed individually, debated, and occasionally, against precedent, approved. The legal logic was simple yet revolutionary. Once the war ended, if an American citizen married an enemy alien, she or he ceased to be an enemy. Love, in this narrow legal sense, neutralized war. A 1946 Justice Department memorandum summarized it with cold brevity. Marriage to a U.S. citizen constitutes grounds for change of classification. Subject no longer regarded as hostile, and just like that, the same system that had imprisoned them now recognized their freedom, through the language of paperwork. The ethical echo in the years that followed, historians would debate these events as curiosities, footnotes in the vast machinery of World War II. But for those who lived it, the question was simpler. What does humanity owe itself, even in war? The Texas camps became an unintended experiment in that question. Guards learned empathy. Civilians learned that propaganda's enemy could become a neighbor. And the women, labeled dangerous by nations, rediscovered trust in the most unlikely place, among strangers in a foreign land. It wasn't rebellion. It was endurance through kindness. Many of those who stayed after the war refused interviews, preferring silence to spectacle. But their legacy lingered, in surnames on rural mailboxes, in bilingual children's voices, in the quiet pride of communities that once lived beside barbed wire and chose mercy over fear. The bridge by 1945, the war's end loomed, and with it, decisions had to be made. The camps would close, the internees released or repatriated. But for some, departure was no longer an option. They had fallen in love, married, or pledged to return. In the dusty record books of South Texas, these choices appear as brief notations. Released to civilian custody, married local citizen, remains voluntarily in United States. For the state, it was paperwork. For the people, it was destiny. The same fences that once divided enemy from ally now marked the line between captivity and belonging. Texas, that vast, unforgiving land, had turned a wartime prison into the unlikely ground for reconciliation. The rules had been tested. Hearts had crossed boundaries once thought unbreakable. And yet, history's weight was not finished pressing down. For every act of compassion in Texas, the war still burned abroad, and a single decision would soon determine who stayed, who left, and who would never return. The letter spring 1945. The war in Europe is ending. American bombers have shattered the Reich. Hitler's armies are collapsing. But here in South Texas, the war still breathes in the sound of boots at roll call, in the rattle of keys at the commandant's desk, in the smell of kerosene lamps flickering through barbed wire at night. Inside one of Crystal City's administrative offices sits a clerk, her typewriter clicking with measured rhythm. Before her lies a document unlike the usual reports and rations lists. It's a petition for marriage, handwritten, careful, in ink that has smudged slightly with sweat. The applicant, Frieda Schuster, 28, German national, internee number A27514. The petitioner, James Wallace, 24, ranch hand from Dimmitt County, Texas. The request is simple in its wording. I, a U.S. citizen, do hereby request permission to marry Miss Schuster, currently interned at Crystal City, Texas. Below, the official stamps have left their cold blue marks. Received, Department of Justice, APR 17-1945. It is one of dozens that reached Washington that year. Most were denied. A few were delayed. And some, a rare, precious few, were approved. For Frieda and James, the letter was more than paperwork. It was a line thrown across a chasm of politics and prejudice. The encounter. They had first met a year earlier, in a cotton field just outside Carrizo Springs. She was part of a supervised work detail. He was the foreman's nephew delivering supplies. The conversation was nothing. A few words about the heat, a polite thank you. But for people who lived in silence, a shared sentence was thunder. In the weeks that followed, the buses came again, And so did James. Sometimes by chance, sometimes by arrangement, he was there when the gray vehicle pulled in. He helped unload tools, carried water, traded a brief word. No letters, no promises, just the slow, invisible weaving of something human in a place designed to erase it. By the winter of 1944, whispers spread through the camp. Another Texan writing to a German. Another guard looking too long. Commandant O'Rourke, experienced and cautious, summoned his senior officers. "The rules are clear," he said. "No personal contact, no fraternization." But even as he spoke, he knew how fragile those words had become. The choice in February 1945, James visited the local county clerk in Dimmitt County. He asked a simple question. "Can a citizen marry someone who's interned by the government?" The clerk blinked, unsure. "Never heard of it," he replied. "You'll have to ask Washington." And so the letter was written. Polite, deferential, and painfully formal. It traveled from Texas to San Antonio, then to Washington, D.C., where it sat for weeks in a stack of similar requests from across the country. Each application was reviewed by multiple offices: the Department of Justice, the War Department, the INS, and occasionally, the Office of Censorship. Most never reached the final stage. But this one did. A memo survives in the archives, typed in dry bureaucratic tone. Subject appears to be of moral character, no evidence of subversive activity. Recommend local inquiry. That local inquiry meant an interview. On a hot afternoon in March, an INS investigator arrived at the Crystal City camp. He spoke with Frida in a small office lined with filing cabinets. The blinds were drawn. The ceiling fan clicked unevenly. "Do you understand the implications of this marriage?" he asked. "I do," she replied softly. "Why?" "Because war will end and people must live again." He made no comment. He simply wrote, "Applicant appears sincere." The walls close in, but not everyone agreed. Some officials saw these petitions as subversive, even dangerous. A regional DOJ report warned, "These associations threaten to undermine morale and discipline in wartime facilities. The appearance of fraternization with enemy aliens invites public criticism." The same week, a letter appeared in a San Antonio newspaper. "Are our boys dying overseas while German women find husbands in Texas?" The question hung heavy. Inside the camp, tensions rose. Guards were reminded of regulations. Internees were warned of consequences. A few relationships ended overnight, by fear, by transfer, by silence. Frida's case lingered in limbo. Her petition neither approved nor denied. Every morning, she asked the camp post office if mail had come. Every morning, the clerk shook his head. James wrote again, this time to the local congressman, enclosing a statement of his own service record, his citizenship papers, and a letter from his pastor vouching for his Christian intentions. It was an act of defiance, cloaked in politeness. The interrogation, on April 2nd, Frida was summoned again, this time by the camp commandant himself. O'Rourke sat behind his desk, arms folded. He studied her through the cigarette smoke. "You know what you're asking for," he said quietly. "Yes, sir. If this goes through, you'll stay here. Your friends will be deported, perhaps soon. You may never see them again." "I know." "And him? He will stand by me." O'Rourke stared for a long moment, then reached for a pen. He signed the bottom of the document marked, "Verified at local level." That was all he could do. The rest would be decided in offices far from Texas. The waiting weeks passed. In Europe, Berlin was falling. On Texas radio, the announcers spoke of victory and surrender. Inside the camp, the internees watched the guards' faces. They could tell the war was ending. One evening, the sky turned a deep violet over the Mesquite Hills. Frida stood near the fence, watching the lights of distant trucks. She thought of ships, of home, of letters that might never arrive. Then a guard approached, holding an envelope. He said nothing. He simply handed it through the wire. Inside was a typed note, brief and official. Marriage request approved under supervision of local authority. Transfer of custody to civilian jurisdiction authorized. The signature at the bottom, Assistant Attorney General, Department of Justice. She read it twice before she believed it. The decision. The wedding took place 2 weeks later in a small Lutheran church near Carrizo Springs. There were no flowers, no music, only a handful of witnesses, including a guard assigned to escort her. She wore a simple white dress sewn from camp linens. He wore his only suit, pressed the night before. When the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," no one moved for a moment, as if unsure whether the law allowed it. Then James stepped forward, and the moment happened quietly, simply, without ceremony or fear. Outside, the South Texas wind blew dust across the church steps. The war was ending. The fences still stood, but for them, history had just changed shape. The last train in. May 1945, the first trains carrying internees back to the East Coast began to leave Crystal City. Women waved from windows. Children pressed their hands to the glass. Some were bound for Ellis Island, others for Europe or Latin America. Frida was not among them. Her name was no longer on the deportation list. Her classification had changed from enemy alien, German, to civilian, spouse of U.S. citizen. The system that had once confined her now recognized her freedom. Not through mercy, but through legal redefinition. Love had become her passport. The victory parades were only weeks away. Flags would wave, crowds would cheer, and the world would call the war over. But for those who had lived behind fences, the real battle was only beginning. The battle to remain, to belong, to prove that their new lives were not accidents but choices. With the train date approaching, everything hinged on signatures, affidavits, and a promise strong enough to change a future. May 1945. Surrender and separation. In Europe, the guns had fallen silent. On May 8th, Victory in Europe Day, church bells rang across the United States. Newspapers in Texas printed bold headlines: "Germany surrenders. War in Europe ends." But inside the barbed wire of Crystal City and Segoville, the mood was not jubilation. It was confusion. Some women wept in joy. Others sat in stunned silence. The country of their birth had ceased to exist, its cities reduced to ash, its future uncertain. Home was no longer a place. It was a question. For Frida and others like her, marriage to an American had transformed that question into something more complicated. She was no longer a prisoner of war, yet she was not entirely free. Freedom came in stages, through paperwork and proof. The Justice Department required affidavits of citizenship, residence guarantees, and loyalty oaths. Every signature was a test, every delay a reminder that emotion could not override the state. Her husband, James, traveled repeatedly to San Antonio to finalize her release. Each trip meant another form, another line at another desk. At one point, a clerk told him bluntly, "It's over, son, but you can't just marry the enemy and call it peace." He said nothing. He only handed her the papers again. The reckoning in Washington, in the capital. Debate raged over what to do with the enemy aliens. With Germany defeated, many officials argued for repatriation, a clean sweep. Others pointed out the humanitarian dilemma. Women and children who had lived quietly in America, some now married, some with U.S.-born infants. Memos circulated between the Department of Justice, War Department, and State Department. Each was a tug-of-war between law and compassion. One memorandum, dated June 1945, summarized the problem. The number of internees married to or engaged with U.S. citizens is increasing. Repatriation in such cases would create adverse publicity and potential constitutional issues. In simpler words, forcing them out would look bad. A compromise emerged. Those married to American citizens could remain under civilian parole, provided local authorities vouched for them. Others would be reviewed case by case. It was not mercy, but administration. Yet for those caught in its gears, it was salvation. Farewells at the fence. The trains kept coming. Each departure drained the camp of laughter, voices, and familiar faces. The women left behind, often married or awaiting approval, stood at the fence to wave goodbye. They pressed small gifts into the hands of departing friends. A photograph, a scarf, a letter that might never be delivered. Guards turned away, pretending not to see. Some had grown attached, despite orders to remain distant. For 3 years, they had shared space, time, and the slow erosion of hostility. Now the war's end felt less like victory than loss. One camp doctor, writing later to his wife, said simply, "They came as prisoners, but they leave as neighbors. That is the strangest miracle I have seen." The return of the ranch. Outside the fences, Texas returned to peacetime rhythms. The men came home from Europe and the Pacific, bringing stories of mud, frost, and horror. Some returned to find the quiet scandal of wartime marriages, whispers in small towns, disapproval from families, surprise from neighbors. "You married a German?" "Yes. But the war's over." Not everyone accepted it so easily. In some communities, resentment lingered. But Texas was big, and forgiveness had room to grow in its silence. Time dulled the edges of judgment. For those couples who stayed, life was pragmatic, not romantic. They worked ranches, ran small stores, or took jobs in nearby towns. The women learned English more fluently. The men learned patience with accents and homesickness. Each day, they built the kind of peace that no treaty could sign. The paper road even. After release, the bureaucracy trailed them like a shadow. Frida's certificate of parole termination arrived months later, mailed from Washington. It was a single sheet of paper, typed and impersonal, stating she was no longer subject to internment restrictions. It contained no acknowledgement of her ordeal, only her name, date, and file number. But that piece of paper meant she could finally walk the streets without permission slips or escorts. It meant she could visit a store, attend church, write letters without censors' stamps. It meant she was, at last, invisible. Not a prisoner, not a case file, just another Texan's wife. The unapproved. Not everyone's story ended so cleanly. For some couples, approval never came. Their letters were intercepted, their requests denied. A few internees were repatriated against their will, shipped to a devastated Germany they no longer recognized. Years later, some of those women returned, this time as immigrants, legally, on ships carrying refugees and displaced persons. They carried memories of heat, fences, and a cowboy who had once smiled through barbed wire. For some, reunion came. For others, it was a letter unanswered, a story closed too soon. History preserved their names only in fragments. A surname on a manifest, a photo in an archive, a church record filed under wartime irregular. The flood of homecomings. By late 1946, most Texas internment camps were closing. Kennedy shut down first, then Seagoville, and finally Crystal City. Barracks were dismantled. Lumber was sold. Grass reclaimed the open ground where towers once stood. Today, only a few concrete foundations remain. But for the couples who had met across those fences, the war's memory lingered in their daily lives. They had built homes out of ration wood and war surplus, raised children fluent in 2 languages, and carried surnames that bridged continents. In the eyes of history, they were anomalies. In the eyes of Texas, they were simply neighbors. The ceremony of citizenship. In 1948, Frida stood once again before a desk, this time not as an internee, but as an applicant for citizenship. The official asked her to raise her right hand and repeat the oath of allegiance. When she finished, he stamped her certificate and smiled. "Welcome home," he said. It was a phrase she had waited years to hear, but it also carried irony. Home had not been a place she was born to, but one she had chosen. Her journey had begun in confinement and ended in belonging. She framed the certificate and placed it beside her wedding photo. 2 documents, one coldly bureaucratic, one softly human, defining the same miracle. The echo in records historians later pieced together this chapter of wartime America from boxes of yellowed papers in the National Archives. Marriage petitions, parole forms, commandant reports, and local newspaper clippings. One article from the Carrizo Springs Javelin dated 1947, described a community barbecue. Among those present were Mr. and Mrs. James Wallace and family. Mrs. Wallace, a native of Germany, came to Texas during the war and chose to remain. That single line, "chose to remain," captures the quiet defiance that turned captivity into home. Across Texas, similar lines appeared in church registers, school enrollment records, and census rolls. German names joined Anglo, Mexican, and Czech surnames, merging into the mosaic that has always defined the state. The wider picture. By the end of the 1940s, roughly 6,000 German civilians had been interned in the U.S., hundreds in Texas alone. A small but significant number of marriages between internees and Americans were recorded, perhaps a few dozen at most. Statistically, it was insignificant. Humanly, it was extraordinary. Each one defied wartime propaganda, legal barriers, and social norms. Each one proved that even in a century defined by destruction, connection could still survive. The final fence years later, visitors to the old Crystal City site would find only sunflowers growing through the cracks of the foundations. The pool where children once swam is filled with soil and silence. But if you stand at sunset, you can still hear the wind over the mesquite. The same wind that once carried the voices of guards, children, and women who sang to remember who they were. Somewhere, down an unpaved road, a wooden fence still stands. The boards have weathered gray, the wire rusted, but it marks the same line where once a soldier and a prisoner saw each other and didn't look away. That, perhaps, is where peace truly began. The camps were closing. The war was over, but the reckoning had only begun. Texas had witnessed something few places in wartime ever did: compassion strong enough to survive victory. The war ended, but the paperwork did not, and the consequences rippled through families, towns, and ranches for years to come. The silence after war. By early 1946, the war had been over for months, yet the internment camps of Texas still hummed with uneasy life. Fences remained intact, guards still patrolled, paperwork still moved between Washington and San Antonio. Freedom, it turned out, required just as much administration as captivity. At Crystal City, fewer than half of the original internees remained. Some awaited repatriation to Germany or Latin America. Others lingered in limbo, not citizens, not prisoners, simply present. Among them were the women who had married Texans, living in temporary quarters while their legal status caught up with their hearts. The Justice Department called them transition cases. To them, it felt like suspension, caught between two worlds, waiting for a government stamp to confirm what love had already decided. Meanwhile, across the state, the machinery of internment was slowly dismantled. The Kennedy camp closed in September 1945. Seagoville followed that December. By February 1946, Crystal City, once the largest family camp in the United States, shut its gates for the last time. But closing a camp was not as simple as cutting wire. Every building had to be inventoried, every document archived, every detainee accounted for. Those who were released signed final papers acknowledging the end of their custodial period. Some cried, some refused to look back. When the last train departed from Crystal City, the camp commandant ordered the gates locked. A single guard remained for 2 weeks to ensure nothing was left behind. Then he too went home. The people who stayed for the newlyweds, staying in Texas, was an act of quiet courage. They had crossed the line from internment to integration, but their welcome was uncertain. In rural communities, gossip traveled faster than forgiveness. Some locals viewed them with suspicion. Those German women, weren't they prisoners? But Texas has always had a way of absorbing outsiders. Within months, the gossip softened, replaced by curiosity and eventually acceptance. Work was plentiful. Ranches needed hands, towns needed teachers and clerks, schools reopened for returning veterans' children. The women adapted quickly. They spoke English with soft accents, kept their homes tidy, baked bread that smelled of another continent. They became Sunday school volunteers, nurses, and seamstresses. They raised children who recited the Pledge of Allegiance in classrooms that stood not far from the fences where their mothers had once been counted as enemies. Each small act of normal life, a handshake at church, a new name in the phone book, helped erase the stigma of captivity. Over time, the past became a story told only within families, if at all. The numbers behind the faces between 1941 and 1948. The United States interned more than 30,000 civilians of German descent, including families from Latin America. In Texas alone, estimates suggest that 5,000 to 6,000 passed through the camps. Precise numbers of marriages between internees and Americans are difficult to determine, but historians identify several dozen confirmed cases. A tiny fraction statistically, yet remarkable symbolically. Among those recorded, most were women married to local ranchers, guards, or civilian workers. Some marriages lasted a lifetime. Others faltered under the weight of post-war suspicion or cultural difference. But each represented a victory of humanity over the machinery of total war. The towns that remembered, in Carrizo Springs, locals still spoke of the camp people decades later. Not with malice, but with a kind of bemused nostalgia. Old-timers recalled the buses that once rolled past, the sound of foreign songs drifting on summer evenings, the neat gardens the internees left behind. A few of those gardens survived, rows of fig trees and yucca plants that continued to bloom long after the camp itself was gone. Ranchers who had employed internees kept photographs in family albums, labeling them simply, "The Germans, 1944. By the 1960s, when historians and journalists rediscovered the story, many locals were surprised anyone cared. "Those camps?" One rancher laughed in an interview. "We didn't think it was history. It was just wartime." Yet, in retrospect, it became clear how unusual it was. An episode in which the boundaries of war bent under the weight of ordinary decency. The bureaucrat's legacy for the U.S. government, the closure of the camps was merely administrative housekeeping. Files were boxed, reports submitted, and the chapter closed with the dull finality of record stamps. No official apology was issued, no ceremony held. The nation turned its attention to rebuilding Europe and confronting a new adversary, the Soviet Union. But within the archives, the paperwork told another story. In the cold language of memoranda, compassion occasionally slipped through. A field officer in 1946 wrote, "Subjects formerly classified as enemy aliens have shown exemplary conduct. Communities appear to have accepted them without incident." A small sentence, but it meant everything. The private reckonings. The women themselves rarely spoke publicly about their internment. Many chose silence, perhaps from shame, perhaps from a desire to protect their children from prejudice. When asked decades later, one woman who had married a Texas farmer said, "I wanted to be known for the life I made, not the fence I came from." Some returned to Germany after the war to visit family, only to find their hometowns gone, their relatives scattered or dead. They came back to Texas with tears and a strange gratitude for the land that had imprisoned them, yet given them a future. Others never left again. They built houses with screened porches, planted pecan trees, joined church choirs. When asked where they were from, they sometimes said simply, "Here." The generations that followed by the 1950s, their children were growing up as Texans, speaking English at school, German only in whispered lullabies. They played baseball, joined the Scouts, and fought in later wars under the same flag that had once held their mothers captive. In family albums, the past appeared only as a curiosity, a black and white photo of barracks, a faded ID card tucked between pages. The next generation often didn't learn the full story until adulthood. Some discovered it through historians, others by accident, cleaning out attics and finding government correspondence stamped "confidential." What they found was both astonishing and humbling, that their parents' love had defied a nation's fear, and somehow survived. A quiet integration. As time passed, the wartime stigma evaporated. By the 1970s, many of those former internees were U.S. citizens. Their accents softened, their lives indistinguishable from any other families. They attended veterans' parades beside their husbands, baked pies for local fairs, and watched their grandchildren march in school bands. Texas had folded their story into its own vast, complex identity, a place always defined by newcomers, always skeptical of boundaries. The landscape heals. The sites of the old camps return to dust. At Crystal City, the land was repurposed for agriculture, then partially developed. A small memorial marker now stands where the main gate once did. A stone plaque surrounded by cactus and silence. Few visitors come. Those who do find little to see, but much to feel. Standing there, the wind carries the same dry warmth it did in 1944. The sound of trucks on distant highways replaces the echo of guard boots. The ghosts of those years are gentle, more curious than mournful. Because in the end, what happened in Texas was not a tragedy alone. It was a strange, quiet victory. The barbed wire was gone, the camps dismantled, but their shadows lingered, not as shame, but as lessons written in sun and dust. What began as a wartime arrangement had become a peacetime choice. Where to build a life. Shall I continue to Aftermath, Section 2? Building lives from dust post-war Texas was booming. The oil fields pumped, the farms recovered, and the ranches thrived on the steady rhythm of work and faith. The war's end had released a surge of energy across America. The GI Bill, the housing boom, the optimism of a nation that had survived its darkest test. For the former internees who stayed, the world outside the fences felt wide and raw. Freedom came with its own kind of fear. No guards, no schedules, no clear rules. They learned to live by instinct again. Frida and James moved to a small ranch outside Crystal City, where the horizon stretched unbroken for miles. Their house was modest, built from surplus army lumber. They kept chickens, raised 2 children, and worked the land from dawn until the sky turned copper, and the cicadas began their night chorus. To their neighbors, they were simply the Wallaces. The war was a topic best left behind, but inside the home, reminders lingered. A folded camp identification tag tucked into a Bible. A German prayer book with a handwritten note. Texas, 1945. And a faded photograph of a fence line at sunset. The place where 2 lives had first crossed paths. The broader story as the decades passed. Scholars began piecing together the broader history of America's wartime internment, beyond the more famous Japanese-American story. By the 1980s, the Crystal City Family Internment Camp emerged as a case study in the complexities of civil liberties during total war. Documentaries, local museum exhibits, and university theses unearthed forgotten letters, photographs, and government reports. The records showed not only injustice, but humanity. Reports noted the efficiency of camp schools, the meticulous cleanliness of the grounds, and the remarkable absence of violence. It was as though the people inside the fences had decided that the best resistance was grace. The story of German women who married Texans stood out precisely because it contradicted wartime propaganda. It didn't fit the simple categories of good and evil, friend and foe. It was inconvenient history, too gentle for a narrative built on victory. Memory in the landscape Texas forgets loudly. Wind erases footprints. Rain smooths the past, but sometimes the land remembers in small ways. In Carrizo Springs, a few old ranchers still point to where the buses used to turn. In Kennedy, locals still find fragments of concrete foundations buried beneath mesquite roots. And at Segoville, the old prison compound still stands, reused, repurposed, but quietly marked by time. In Crystal City, a small memorial now honors the internees of all backgrounds, German, Japanese, Italian, and others. A simple granite stone bears the inscription, "To those who lived here, to those who waited, and to those who never returned." Every so often, descendants visit, placing flowers or notes in 2 languages. Some bring their children, telling them, "Your grandmother was born behind that fence." The children listen, puzzled. How could their grandmother, who spoke with a soft accent and made perfect Texas chili, have ever been considered an enemy? Changing perceptions. In later decades, the U.S. government officially acknowledged the injustices of wartime internment, though primarily in reference to Japanese Americans. For German and Italian internees, recognition came slowly and quietly, often through local historical societies rather than national apologies. Yet, in Texas, the story endured through oral history, neighbors telling neighbors, pastors writing memoirs, children remembering half-told stories from their parents. It was not bitterness that survived, but gratitude. Many of the women expressed thankfulness that, of all the places they could have been sent, it was here, where strangers had offered kindness instead of cruelty. The fences had divided nations, but the people on both sides had quietly chosen to build bridges instead. Second-generation stories by the 1970s and 1980s. The children of those unions were adults, teachers, lawyers, farmers, and veterans of later wars. Some carried their mothers' German middle names. Others bore first names chosen from the Bible, simple and strong. They grew up speaking English but understanding fragments of lullabies from another language. For many, it wasn't until adulthood that they learned the truth, that their mothers had arrived in America not by immigration, but by detention. The revelation came with both pride and sorrow. Pride, because their parents' love had defied fear. Sorrow, because that love had been born inside walls of injustice. A daughter of one such couple interviewed in 1992 said, "I never saw my parents as political people. They were just people who wanted to live, to raise kids, to belong. My mother said Texas saved her." The historical reckoning in 1985, the Texas Historical Commission placed a marker near the old Crystal City site, officially recognizing it as an internment camp. The dedication ceremony was quiet. No speeches of blame or guilt, only acknowledgement. Former internees attended, some in their 70s, carrying photographs and children of their own. They spoke of the heat, the dust, the kindness of guards, the sound of church bells on Sundays. They did not speak of bitterness. They spoke of survival. One man, the son of an internee and a Texan, summed it up simply: they came as prisoners. But Texas taught them how to be free. The weight of forgotten stories. For decades, the story remained absent from textbooks, overshadowed by the grander narratives of Normandy, Hiroshima, and the atomic age. But slowly, historians began to understand its deeper importance. It was not a story of battles, but of boundaries, how thin the line between enemy and neighbor can be. It revealed a truth about war, that humanity often survives in the margins, between the orders and the headlines, and that sometimes the most profound victories happen not on the battlefield, but in the quiet courage of two people who refuse to hate each other. The Texas spirit. The Texas that received those women was not a land of easy mercy. It was harsh, pragmatic, unpolished, but also honest. It respected hard work, loyalty, and humility above all else. Those who stayed learned those values quickly. They became part of the land's rhythm. Church bells on Sundays, rodeos in summer, children's laughter echoing across the fields. By the time they grew old, no one called them prisoners anymore. They were Texans, and that was their triumph. The quiet continuation today, the story still lingers in unexpected places. In the surname of a county sheriff descended from one of those marriages, in the blue-eyed child of a teacher who carries her grandmother's maiden name, in a small museum display in Zavala County, showing an ID card beside a pair of work gloves. History has folded their story into its larger pattern, not erased, but absorbed, like ink settling into old parchment. Time has softened the outlines, but the truth remains. Texas, in its vastness, made room for forgiveness when the world was burning with vengeance. Beyond the records, a question remains. What exactly did this chapter say about war? And the human heart? The Texas wind hasn't changed. It still sweeps over mesquite and barbed wire, whistling through fence posts that lean under their own age. If you stand there at dusk, where Crystal City once stood, where the fields roll endlessly toward the horizon, you can almost hear it. Not the clang of gates or the bark of orders, but the faint murmur of lives that refuse to be defined by war. It's difficult, in our age of headlines and memorials, to imagine what it meant to build peace quietly. No parades, no treaties, no cameras. Only people learning to live again after being told they could not. The moral geometry of war, every war builds walls. Of ideology, of fear, of necessity. But even in its most controlled corners, the internment camps, the barbed fences, the stamped documents, human nature slips through. The story of those German women and the Texans they met was not rebellion. It was a natural law asserting itself. The need to connect, to trust, to feel human in a system designed to erase humanity. History tends to celebrate courage in the form of defiance or battle. But perhaps courage also looks like this: a woman saying yes to life in a strange land, a man seeing humanity in someone the world called his enemy, a commandant signing a paper that allows both to walk free. Each act small, each consequence enormous. Texas as the mirror. Texas was never neutral ground. It was fierce, proud, stubborn, a land of heat, labor, and honesty. It reflected people as they were, stripped of pretense. In that landscape, labels faded. A German internee became a woman working a row of cotton. A guard became a man trying to do his job without losing his decency. The fences kept them apart, but the land, wide and indifferent, made them equals under its sky. When the war ended, those fences fell, but their echo remained. They became lines not of division, but of memory, reminders of what can happen when fear rules policy, and what can be redeemed when empathy breaks through. The unwritten history. For decades, these stories were rarely told. They didn't fit the national narrative of victory or victimhood. They were too gentle, too complex, too ordinary. But history, like the land, doesn't forget. It waits until someone listens closely enough. And when the archives were opened, and the photographs examined, a different kind of courage emerged from the dust. Here were people who, in captivity, chose kindness. Here were guards who treated prisoners with respect. Here were civilians who hired the enemy not out of ideology, but because they needed help, and then discovered friendship instead of fear. These are the quiet revolutions that shape civilizations. Not the ones fought with rifles, but the ones fought with dignity. What they left behind today. The descendants of those marriages live ordinary lives. Teachers, ranchers, nurses, engineers. Most don't carry the weight of that past. They carry its peace. They are the proof that reconciliation can take root in soil watered by patience instead of vengeance. When they look back, they see not shame, but survival. Proof that in the heart of a total war, the human instinct for love and belonging was stronger than the politics that tried to suppress it. That's the legacy of Crystal City and the others like it. Not only what America did wrong, but what individuals did right despite it. A fence and a horizon. Imagine again that first moment. A woman stepping from a gray bus, a man watching from a ranch fence. No flags, no symbols, just two people on opposite sides of a rule. Between them, distance, fear, and the hum of history. And yet something in that silence bridged everything. From that glance, lives unfolded. Children born, houses built, stories remembered in kitchens and backyards. Empires fell, presidents changed, the world rebuilt itself. But that moment remained, fragile, defiant, and eternal. It asks a question that still matters. When the world demands enmity, what does it cost to choose empathy instead? The enduring. Lesson war reduces humanity to categories: ally, enemy, captive, citizen. Texas, in that brief moment of history, reminded the world that those categories can be crossed. Not through politics, but through decency. In the end, the people of those camps, and those who met them, achieved what entire nations struggled to do: They learned to live together again. They came as prisoners. They stayed as families. And they never went back. Not because they forgot where they came from, but because they finally found where they belonged. Closing image. The camera pans out across South Texas. The low hum of cicadas. The long shadow of a windmill. The horizon burning gold as the sun sinks behind the brush. Where fences once divided, now wildflowers grow. Yellow and white, their roots tangled through rusted wire. A voice, calm and distant, carries over the wind. War built the fences. Love took them down. Fade to black. End. History isn't just written in battles or treaties. It lives in moments of compassion. In the hands that reached across a fence when the world said not to. If this story moved you, help keep these quiet histories alive. Subscribe to this channel for more true, untold stories from World War II. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next film. And share this documentary, because the world still needs reminders that even in war, humanity can win. They came as prisoners. They stayed as families. And they never went back.